She was just adjusting her gloves. That's all. It was a simple, silent motion known. She'd done 1,000 times, but the way the morning sun hit her forearms, the scars lit up. Long and silver, trailing from wrist to elbow like rivers burned into flesh. Private Mason Ridley saw them, and he laughed. She must have lost every fight she's ever been in. His voice rang sharp across the gravel yard, loud enough to turn heads, loud enough to stop breathing. Some recruits chuckled uncertain, half embarrassed. Then the yard went still. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn. She just pulled the second glove tight, one finger at a time. No one called her Rory. No one ever asked where she'd served or what it had taken to still be standing. And when Mason spoke, no one corrected him. No one stopped him. But someone else had heard, and someone else had remembered what that name once meant. Because those scars weren't signs of weakness. They were the reason others had come home. So who was Echo 6? And why would a general halt an entire training yard just to say that name out loud? If you're watching this, don't scroll past her story. It's not one you'll hear in classrooms, but it's one that matters. Now let's go back to where she stood. Camp Weller, Georgia. 543 hours. The sky was low and thick with humidity, the kind of southern summer morning where the heat arrived early and stayed all day. Gravel shifted under boots as recruits jogged clumsily through drills, their cadence broken, their pace sluggish. The shouting was uneven, the rhythm sloppy. Near the far edge of the yard, just beyond the weapons rack, she stood alone. Staff Sergeant Rory Blake. She wasn't listed on the drill schedule, she wasn't giving orders, but she was always there, quiet, unmoving, present without ever demanding to be seen. Recruits didn't know what to make of her. Some thought she'd been demoted. Others said she was just a burned-out relic, a leftover from an older war no one wanted to talk about anymore. They saw the way she never spoke unless spoken to, the way she didn't wear rank pins, the way her arms were scarred deeply, visibly, and they made up their own stories to explain it all. Most didn't dare ask questions. Mason Ridley did. He was 19, eager, full of confidence, none of it tested. He leaned against the fence line that morning, flanked by 2 other new recruits, smirking in her direction. And when Rory reached down to adjust her glove, that's when the sunlight struck. It hit just right. Her scars lit up silver and pale, winding across her skin like the remnants of a fire that had never fully gone out. Mason didn't hesitate. She must have lost every fight she's ever been in. His voice cut through the morning air, too loud to ignore. A couple of the recruits near him laughed, reflexively. But then the chuckles stopped, because nothing about her moved, not even her eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn around. She simply adjusted her gloves with the same quiet precision she carried through everything. No one called her by name. No one ever asked where she'd served, or what she'd survived to still be standing here. And in that moment, no one stepped in to correct him. No one tried to stop him. It had become routine, this silence, this erasure. Years ago, Rory Blake had returned from war, carrying the weight of a mission that should have killed her. A mission that had taken her entire unit but left her breathing. But there were no medals, no welcome home, no story in the papers. Her unit was classified, the operation sealed. She became just another ghost. No one recorded what she did, and no one remembered her name, except for one man. From across the yard, beyond the formations and the drills, a figure stood quietly near the observation shed, arms crossed, eyes locked on her. General Everett Langford. He hadn't announced his arrival. He didn't wear full dress. But the moment he saw her, something behind his expression changed. Recognition, memory, and perhaps a long-buried debt. And as Mason Ridley stood there, still proud of his own ignorance, still assuming he was in control of the moment, he had no idea that a reckoning had just begun. She walked through the yard like smoke, always present, never lingering. To the recruits, she wasn't a person, she was a presence. A figure who stood at the edge of drills but didn't shout commands. She never took roll, never gave speeches, never explained why she was there. But she always showed up, always early, always watching. Her uniform was standard issue, but it looked different on her, worn in all the right places, creased with years that hadn't been gentle. Her sleeves were usually rolled, and the scars were impossible to miss. They began just below her thumbs, pale, roped, and uneven. They climbed up her forearms in stubborn lines, disappearing beneath the collar of her shirt like they had farther to go. Most recruits glanced once, then looked away. Some whispered, "Probably burned herself in training. I heard she froze under fire. No one even knows her rank. She's not fit to train here." Mason Ridley was louder than most. He didn't whisper. He didn't care if she heard. He looked at her the way people look at cracked statues, something old and broken. A warning more than a story. She was, to him, a leftover. A reminder of a version of the military he didn't think mattered anymore. He hadn't seen war. Not real war. Not the kind that leaves people missing pieces that don't grow back. But Rory Blake never responded. Not to the stares. Not to the rumors. Not even to the snide comments that crept into the morning drills like rust into a rifle. Because Rory had lived long enough to know that silence wasn't weakness, it was armor. She wasn't interested in explaining herself to boys who still thought medals made heroes. She'd met too many people with clean boots and loud mouths. They didn't know how heavy real memory wash how quiet it became over time. And truthfully, she wasn't there for them. She didn't need their respect. She didn't expect it. She moved with the stillness of someone who had already decided who she was long ago. There were no outbursts, no corrections, no need to raise her voice. Because there was nothing they could say that she hadn't already survived. And still, Mason kept watching her, mocking her in half-jokes, grinning like she was some outdated myth walking around on legs that should have given up years ago. But somewhere inside him, though he didn't know it yet, something was unsettled. Because deep down, even the blind can feel when they're staring at something that refuses to fall apart. Rory Blake didn't ask to be noticed. She didn't speak up for herself. But one day soon, that silence would speak for her. And when it did, no one, especially Mason, would laugh again. Years before Camp Weller, before the silence, before the stares, there was fire. The city was called Marjo. A dust-choked corner of the world barely marked on maps, but full of bodies that bled just like anyone else. Concrete streets split under heat and shell fire, air heavy with ash, and buildings that crumbled like wet paper when mortars came down. That's where she was sent. Rory Blake. Back then, she wasn't silent. She was in motion, fast, precise, mission-bound. She'd been part of a unit no one talked about. Not officially, not on record. Hawkbreaker Unit 9. A mobile recovery and engineering detachment trained to operate behind fire-lines evacuation, med-X, survival builds under fire. People call them the last ones in and the last hope out. That day in Marjo, the unit had orders to extract a downed crew trapped in the central corridor near a school complex. It was supposed to be routine, but war doesn't respect routines. The call came in late, too late. Someone had turned local children into weapons. Rory saw the boy just before the explosion. He couldn't have been older than 10. Skinny arms, dusty sandals, a backpack too large for his frame. He walked right past two soldiers, no sudden movements, no sound. Then the heat came. Blinding. Searing. Final. The world flipped sideways. Steel and skin tore in the same breath. Screams collapsed under the roar of ignition. When Rory woke up, she was covered in blood that wasn't hers. Her rifle was gone. Her hearing came in pulses, like being underwater. All she could make out was fire crackling around the wreckage and a shape slumped against a blown-open wall. Her captain. Still breathing. Barely. She crawled. No gear, no cover, no time. She pulled him out by the straps of his vest, dragging his weight over broken concrete and flaming debris. Each time her elbows hit the ground, another layer of skin tore from her arms. The metal was molten. Her gloves melted off before she even noticed. She couldn't feel her hands after the second corridor. She couldn't breathe. But she didn't stop. She got him out. All the way to the evac line. Collapsed as the second wave of fire swept across the street behind her. They said she shouldn't have survived. No one else from Hawkbreaker did. She woke up 6 days later in a field unit tent, her arms swathed in cold wraps, pain moving like electricity just beneath the skin. She asked for her unit. They didn't answer. she asked again. They handed her a clipboard. You were the only one extracted alive, the medic said quietly. We couldn't even identify the others. At first, they said she'd be processed for commendation. But then came the revisions. The mission was classified. Too many moving parts. Too many political eyes. Too much at stake. Eventually, the commendation vanished. So did the name of the unit, and so did hers. Call sign, Echo 6. The one who answers back when all others fall silent. That's what the team used to say. Because Rory didn't wait for backup. She was the backup. She showed up when the line went dead. Now she was just another line that disappeared on paper. They released her 6 months later with restricted status in re-entry optional assignments. Which really meant, we're not going to tell anyone what you did, but we won't stop you from sticking around. She didn't go home. She didn't ask why. Instead, she reported to Camp Weller. No rank markings, no command. Just a name on a list. Blake, RJ, attached to support services. The scars were already healing when she arrived. But not evenly. Some formed ridges. Some split again under pressure. The worst ones wrapped around her inner elbows where skin bends and memory stays sharp. No one at Weller asked what happened. And after the first few weeks, no one cared. She stood where she was told. Slept in the barracks no one used. Trained when no one was watching. And every now and then, when the light hit her arms just right, people stared. But none of them ever saw Marjo. None of them saw the boy. Or the fire. Or the captain she carried through hell. All they saw were scars. And silence. And assumed that meant the story was over. But stories like hers don't end. They just go quiet. When she arrived at Camp Weller, no one noticed. There was no ceremony. No file brief to command. No introduction to the instructors. Just her name, Blake R.J., typed in small print on a support roster and a bunk assignment in the corner of an unused barracks wing. What was left of Hawkbreaker Unit 9 had already been erased. The mission logs from Marjo were sealed. The unit's designation was flagged, inactive, total loss. Officially, they didn't exist anymore. And Rory? She existed only as a personnel ghost. No rank was pinned to her chest. No ribbons, no campaign tabs. Only a duty note assigning her as auxiliary assistant, non-instructional. She didn't object. She didn't ask why. She rose early, reported without fail. Cleaned the ranges, restocked the supply sheds, ran drills no one asked her to run. And when the new recruits showed up, they saw her before they ever heard her. At first, they ignored her. Then came the jokes. Quiet at first. Then louder. She was the burnt lady, the phantom sergeant, the one who never talks. Some thought she'd washed out. Others assumed she was there on probation, an example of what not to become. No one ever asked what happened. No one ever used the name Echo 6. To them, she was just another regulation anomaly, something in the background they didn't need to understand. But Rory Blake didn't ask for their understanding. She didn't chase recognition. She didn't flinch when they whispered, and she didn't correct them when they lied. Because she knew what they didn't. She knew what it was to carry men who couldn't walk. To silence a radio channel so their position wouldn't be given away. To bleed behind a wall for hours just so someone else could live long enough to be extracted. The scars were there to remind her, not them, of what had been traded. And so she trained anyway. She did push-ups beside the recruits who sneered. She ran the same laps they did, sometimes twice. She checked their posture when they thought no one was watching. She fixed their grip, reset their stance, quietly, without comment, without taking credit. Every morning, she showed up before dawn. And every night she cleaned the same rifle she'd been handed on her first day back, though it had never once been fired. It didn't bother her. Because she'd learned something in the smoke of Marjo that they hadn't. Some weapons don't need to be loud. And some steel never rusts because it's already walked through fire and come out clean. It was Monday. The air hung heavy with humidity, and the gravel lot hadn't cooled from the day before. PT had begun before sunrise, but the cadence was weak. The rhythm of discipline was missing, buried beneath heat, routine, and carelessness. No one noticed the black SUV when it rolled through the side gate. No one looked up when the passenger door opened. General Everett Langford stepped out without fanfare. No medals, no aids. Just a plain uniform, one stripe at the collar, and a gaze that had seen more funerals than promotions. He hadn't come for inspection. He hadn't announced his visit. He just stood quiet, still, watching from the edge of the yard with arms crossed in expression unreadable. The recruits jogged past him without recognition. But then his eyes locked on her. On Rory Blake. She was by the weapons rack again, checking the same training rifle she always checked, even though it hadn't been fired in months. Her movement was automatic, quiet, intentional. She didn't look up, but she knew he was there. He hadn't changed much, maybe a little slower, a little grayer. But Rory remembered the sound of his voice over the comms that day in Marjo, calling for an evac that never arrived in time. She remembered the way his hands shook when he took the captain's body bag 3 days later. She didn't flinch now, didn't acknowledge him. She just did her job. And still Langford kept watching. Mason Ridley didn't notice any of it. He was at the far end of the yard, leaning against the fence again, arms folded, smirk in place. Rory had passed by once already that morning. He'd thrown her a look, same as always. Something between smug and dismissive. He didn't speak, not yet. But his expression did enough. Langford took a step forward. Then another. And then he spoke calm, low, but cutting through the noise like glass through fabric. Private Ridley. Mason turned, a little surprised to be singled out. He stood upright quickly, though not fast enough to hide his confusion. Sir? Langford's eyes didn't blink. You find those scars funny? The yard froze. It wasn't the words. It was the way he said them. Controlled, flat, like a blade held steady in the hand of someone who'd used it before. Mason hesitated. I didn't mean anything by it, sir. Langford stepped closer. That right? His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. Because I heard you did, loud and clear. The other recruits had stopped running. One by one, their heads turned. A few instructors looked up from the far bleachers but didn't move. The air felt like it held its breath. Mason's hands fidgeted at his sides. I just meant, he faltered. She's not exactly look I didn't know. You didn't ask, Langford replied. You judged. He turned his gaze past Mason, past the frozen recruits, back toward the woman still standing at the weapons rack. Then, with a voice that carried like a command remembered by muscle and marrow, he spoke. Echo 6, report to the front. And just like that, the yard went silent. The yard had gone still. Private Mason Ridley shifted his weight without meaning to, and the crunch of gravel beneath his boot felt too loud. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by something uncertain. His mouth opened, then closed again, before he finally spoke, almost under his breath. I didn't mean anything by it, sir. General Langford didn't move. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't scold. But the words that followed cut with quiet precision. You didn't mean anything, he repeated, voice low but unmistakable. Then he looked past Mason, not at him, but through him as if speaking to something larger. Some scars aren't reminders of loss. They're the reason others came home. That was when the yard stopped breathing. No instructor called cadence. No one adjusted their stance. Even the early morning wind seemed to still. Langford stepped forward, slow and calm, and turned toward the far edge of the lot toward the woman near the weapons rack. His voice didn't rise in volume, but it carried. Echo 6, report to the front. The words hit with clarity. No urgency. No drama. Just absolute finality. The reaction was immediate. Every recruit on that field turned. Slowly, instinctively. Some blinked, confused. A few glanced toward one another, wondering if they'd heard right. But they had. They all had. The name wasn't new. They had heard it before in stories, in whispers, sometimes during night watch when the older instructors passed time with fragments of things they didn't fully explain. Echo 6. A call sign, not a person. The one who pulled a burning convoy back across the line in Marjo. The one who never showed up in any official report. The one veterans referred to like a ghost, no rank, no records, just reputation. They didn't expect her to be standing right there. Not in plain view. Not in standard fatigues, checking a training rifle. Rory Blake didn't move immediately. She set the rifle back into the rack with care. then turned. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. Her steps were measured, shoulders squared, head level, boots pressing into gravel with quiet confidence. The scars along her arms, usually tucked into shadows or blurred by distance, were now unmistakably clear. Lines of healed trauma ran from her wrists to her biceps, textured and deep, catching the light without shame. She walked through the open like someone who no longer needed permission to be seen. And no one looked away. Langford stood aside as she approached. He didn't salute. He didn't smile. He looked her directly in the eye and spoke with the weight of memory. "Welcome back, Staff Sergeant." His tone wasn't ceremonial. It was personal. The recruit's very last one watched in silence. For the first time that morning, Mason Ridley didn't know where to stand. His hands had stopped moving. His face was pale. Rory slowly turned toward him. She said nothing at first. Her eyes locked with his. Not to embarrass, not to shame, just to make sure he understood. Then she spoke, her voice steady, firm, and unshaken. "These scars don't mean I lost. They mean I survived what you can't imagine." She didn't say it to sound strong. She said it because it was true. Mason didn't answer. Couldn't. Langford looked back to the full formation. He let the moment breathe. Then, when it was quiet enough for every word to land without interruption, he addressed them all. "Some of you fight for glory. Echo 6 fights for the ones who can't fight for themselves." It was the only speech he gave. No one applauded. No one whispered. No one dared to speak over what had just happened. And then he turned to Rory again. "You've earned the right to speak." She didn't. She didn't need to. She gave a small, respectful nod and stepped back without a word. It was enough. Because what followed wasn't just silence. It was recognition. The kind you can't teach. The kind that doesn't need noise to be remembered. It was once just a name passed between soldiers quietly, near firelight, without fanfare. A trace of someone who had done something real and then disappeared before the system could explain it. No one expected her to be here. Not like this. Not in daylight, standing on bare ground, offering no defense and asking for none. She didn't smile. Didn't gloat. Made no gesture to say, "I told you so." She stood still. Present. Grounded. And across the yard, not a single breath stirred. The silence held. And this time, it belonged to her. For a moment, everything held still. The rifles stayed slung. Boots didn't shift. No one adjusted their posture. The sun had risen a few inches higher, but no one squinted. It wasn't just silence, it was the kind that pressed into the skin and made people remember where they were and who they were standing next to. Rory Blake stood facing Mason Ridley. Not angry. Not defensive. Just steady. Her words had already landed. "These scars don't mean I lost. They mean I survived what you can't imagine." She didn't repeat them. She didn't need to. And Mason Hay didn't say a thing. Whatever joke he had lined up days before, whatever smirk had been carved into his habits, it was gone now. His hands stayed down. His mouth didn't open. His shoulders had dropped, not in defeat but in recognition. He hadn't known. Now he did. And that changed everything. Across the yard, the rest of the recruits had stopped whispering. The looks they exchanged weren't curious anymore. They were respectful, uneasy, maybe, but rooted in something real. Something that no training module had prepared them for. General Langford stepped forward, not to take command, not to dramatize, but to say what needed to be said for the record that would never be written. "Some of you fight for glory," he said, his voice measured and quiet, but carrying. "Echo 6 fights for the ones who can't fight for themselves." That was it. No speech. No follow-up. Just the truth. It was enough. Langford gave Rory a brief note that meant more than any rank or salute and stepped aside. He didn't leave. He just let the weight of the moment settle where it needed to. Rory looked over the yard one last time. She didn't glare. She didn't search for approval. She simply turned and began walking back to her post. Her boots didn't move faster. Her posture didn't change. But the way everyone else looked at her did. Private Holloway, who'd once laughed along with Mason, lowered his head as she passed. Private Torres straightened her spine without being told. Even Brooks, who normally stood with his arms crossed, brought his hands behind his back like he wasn't sure what to do with them anymore. As Rory walked, the line of recruits shifted not to step away, but to give space, not out of fear, out of respect. She stopped near the rack, the same spot she always stood. But now, it was different. Because now, every eye on that field had seen who she really was. They didn't know all the details. They hadn't earned the right to. But they knew enough. They knew what scars looked like when they meant survival. They knew what silence felt like when it wasn't weakness, but proof that someone had already lived through more than they could imagine. And most of all, they knew who she was. Not by name, but by call sign. Echo 6. That wasn't just a myth anymore. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. For the rest of the hour, drills resumed. Cadence returned cleaner this time. Tighter, more focused. And every time Rory moved checking gear, correcting posture, adjusting form, no one laughed. They listened. Because sometimes the loudest person in the yard isn't the one giving orders. Sometimes it's the one who speaks only when the moment truly calls for it. And when she stepped back into the shadows she'd always stood in, no one saw her the same way again. Not because she asked them to, because she didn't have to. 3 weeks later, she was gone. No announcement. No ceremony. No orders filed through the office. She packed the same way she'd lived, quietly, efficiently, without anyone noticing until it was already done. It was early morning again. Same heat, same gravel lot, same endless drills starting up across Camp Weller. But this time, Rory Blake wasn't walking to the training yard. She was headed for the exit gate. A duffel slung over her shoulder, boots laced, sleeves rolled. Her steps were calm, measured. There was nothing dramatic about her departure. No one had told the recruits. No one had gathered them. But somehow, they knew. When she turned the last corner before the vehicle depot, she stopped. A line had formed. 2 rows. Full dress. Every recruit standing shoulder to shoulder, boots aligned, arms at their sides. No one moved. No one spoke. There had been no command to do this. But there they were. At the front of the line stood Private Mason Ridley. His posture was straight, but his hands were tight behind his back like he didn't trust them to stay steady. His eyes were fixed just above the gravel. As Rory approached, the space between them narrowed, but he didn't speak until she was right in front of him. Then quietly he said, "Ma'am, I didn't know." Rory looked at him fully, directly for the first time since that day in the yard. There was no anger in her expression. No distance. Just clarity. And she answered, calm and even, "That's the problem. You never looked deep enough." He nodded once. He didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. She stepped past him. Boots against gravel. One step, then another. And as she moved along the line still without a single order spoken, every recruit raised their hand in silent salute. No one broke formation. No one asked for recognition. They just stood, in full stillness, in full respect. Because now they understood. She hadn't come here to be remembered. She'd come here so they wouldn't forget what quiet strength really looked like. She reached the last gate and paused, only once turning slightly, just enough to see the rows behind her, standing tall against the rising sun. Then she walked out. No applause. No words. Just the sound of her footsteps fading into the dust. Some heroes' names are never chanted. No medals hung in glass cases. No lines written in textbooks. But their stories stay. Not in headlines. Not in parades. But beneath the skin of those who watched, who learned, and who now carry forward the weight they once mocked. Rory Blake never asked for a salute. But on the day she left, she received one anyway. In absolute, reverent silence. Some people serve loudly, others save lives and disappear. Rory Blake reminded us that not every hero wears medals, and not every battle leaves visible wounds. Some scars speak for those who never had the chance. And sometimes, the strongest among us are the ones who never ask for thanks. They just show up, quietly, and carry the weight others can't. This story isn't just about military honor. It's about how we treat the quiet ones. The older veteran at the grocery store. The neighbor who doesn't talk much but never misses a flag raising. The woman who walks with a limp but stands when the anthem plays. Look deeper. Always look deeper. Because you never know who stood for you when it counted. If this story moved you, we invite you to subscribe. Every week, we share real stories of silent strength, forgotten sacrifice, and the kind of dignity that doesn't fade. Thank you for watching. Until next time, be kind, walk slow, and honor quietly. God bless, and take care.